Hi, my name is Brad and this is episode 7 in a YouTube lecture series about intonation in English called Listening for Meaning. In previous episodes, I've introduced theoretical concepts that are essential in understanding intonation within the systemic functional linguistic approach: metafunction, stratification, and rank. In this episode, I briefly introduced 3 more crucial concepts of SFL theory: axis, delicacy, and instantiation. If we consider this series a sort of multimodal textbook, as I've mentioned, then this episode completes part 1 on the theoretical foundations of this course. In subsequent episodes, I plan to get into some detailed analysis of real-world texts, particularly in terms of phonological analysis, but also starting to explore further how intonation choices contribute to meaning making in naturally occurring spoken discourse. But throughout, I will continue to assume and refer to these theoretical concepts as the basis for understanding and explaining how we make and express meanings through the sonic resources of our voice that collectively we call intonation. So firstly, axis relates to aspects of language: system and structure. System is the paradigmatic axis. Speakers choose from sets of options. Thus, the underlying principle of the paradigmatic or systemic axis is choice. Structure is the syntagmatic axis. Speakers have to use certain structures in language. Thus, the underlying principle of the syntagmatic or structural axis is obligation. So, as the Introduction to Functional Grammar, 3rd edition, puts it, structure is the syntagmatic ordering in language, patterns or regularities in what goes together with what. System, by contrast, is ordering on the other axis, patterns in what could go instead of what. This is the paradigmatic ordering in language. The italics are in the original. Halliday, in the 2004 edition of Introduction to Functional Grammar, edited by Matthiessen, refers to axis under the heading of system in brackets paradigmatic order. And this is because while Halliday started out in the early 1960s, following his teacher J.R. Firth, in discussing system and structure on equal terms, over time he came to see systems as primary, with structures as a secondary aspect, as the output of a systemic choice, perhaps partly as a reaction against the structural perspective dominating linguistics, then as now. Thus, choice is central to systemic functional theory. Speakers choose from systemic potentials, sets of options, and part of the meaning of such choices is that a speaker has chosen one option rather than another option from a systemic paradigm. As I will discuss in later episodes, this systemic principle is important in phonological analysis. One should always keep in mind that speakers are making a specific choice and not other choices that could have been chosen but weren't, which is helpful in determining which choice has been made in specific instances. Speakers in general make sure that listeners know which choice it is that's being made through their phonetic expression. Thus, the less expected a choice, the more exaggerated its phonetic expression. So, for example, the mood system in the clause has options of declarative or interrogative mood. If a speaker selects interrogative, there is a further set of sub-options of polar interrogative, yes-no questions, or were interrogative, content questions. This notion that systems are ordered such that particular choices have further subsets of options for each choice is called delicacy. The choice of polar or were interrogative is a further step in delicacy from interrogative in the mood system. Structure, meanwhile, accounts for how systemic choices appear in the unit to which they belong. Example, in a clause, a declarative mood choice appears as the structure of obligatory subject finite ordering, it is, while polar interrogative mood has finite subject ordering, is it? And the were interrogative has the were element at the beginning of the clause, what is it? This image, taken from Introduction to Functional Grammar 3rd edition, shows the mood system ordered horizontally in delicacy, moving from least delicate to the left to most delicate to the right. and the structural outputs, the ordering of clause elements, example subject-finite structure, or the presence or absence of an element, example a word adjunct, or the absence of the subject for an imperative clause, example do it, not shown here. Note also in this slide image, Halliday unfortunately always used the upside down V symbol called the caret symbol for two different purposes. As we have seen already in this series, it is used to indicate a silent beat or silent ictus in a rhythm or where an utterance begins with non-salient syllables. And he also uses it, as in this image, to indicate structure, here for example the finite subject structure. In fact, Halliday used the upper caret symbol found on most keyboards to indicate structure, and the lower caret symbol to indicate a silent ictus. I find this quite unhelpful as one of the few people in SFL studying phonology. But as this structural symbol is the most familiar to those working in SFL, it seems that the best thing would be to use some other symbol to indicate a silent beat. One possible candidate, for example, is the backward slash symbol instead of the caret symbol. However, for now, I will stick with the upside down V caret symbol. We just need to note that in SFL phonological transcription, a caret symbol means a silent ictus, while elsewhere in SFL, it refers to a structure such as finite subject ordering. Another issue relates to the way Halliday theorises the axial relations between systems and structures as a relationship of realisation. Structure is presented as realising systemic choice. To quote from the Introduction to Functional Grammar, structural operations, inserting elements, ordering elements, and so on, are explained as realising systemic choices. Now, of course, if we go back to episode 4 on stratification, this is also a bit confusing. Stratification is also described in SFL as being based on the principle of realisation. Choices at one stratum realise choices at the higher stratum. So here, structures too, such as subject finite order, are also seen as realising or expressing, indicating, choices in systems such as mood. I aim to come back to this issue later in the series when I explore the discourse semantic functions of intonation choices. Looked at from the perspective of discourse semantics, the way that subject finite structure works to indicate mood choice is analogous to the way pitch contour types work to realise the tone choices that are co-selected with mood choices to realise complex discourse semantic choices, which are in turn the realisation of higher strata contextual choices in tenor relations. More on this later in this episode. I should also mention at this point, in this series, while I aim to explain the theoretical concepts of SFL that are necessary to understand how intonation works, I am of course only presenting my own limited understanding of SFL theory and description. I don't claim to have complete expertise in all aspects of SFL or the final word on theoretical issues in the field. What I present is no more or less than my own understanding, but I do think that the study of intonation both raises issues and throws particular light on some key aspects of SFL theory. So I will also point out where I feel that there are issues in the existing account of SFL in relation to intonation study, and offer my own views on these. And of course some of these views might not be in agreement with some accounts of work in SFL, whether that of Halliday or others. Anyone who is studying or using SFL within a formal institutional setting such as a university, who is listening into this course, should of course consult their teachers and supervisors on any issues that arises in or out of this series. As I've said before, I'm not in any position to provide individual tutoring to anyone viewing these lectures, so my own approach should not supersede that being taken in the context of a formal student-supervisor relationship. Academic teachers will of course make their own decisions regarding any of the materials in this course. My aim is more to provide resources for consideration and potential use, not to argue a particular case for any particular theoretical issue or viewpoint as they arise. But I can only and will only provide my take on intonation within the SFL approach. All that I'm doing here is offering, in the only form available to me, what I've learnt from 2 decades of studying intonation within the SFL approach. I will try as much as possible to limit my lectures either to, on the one hand, the theoretical understanding and description of language as presented in Introduction to Functional Grammar and Halliday and Greaves, as well as later in Martin 1992, along with other relevant works such as that by Van Leuven in particular. Or where I depart from or problematise aspects of these works, I will do this only on the basis of my own empirical analytical experience with work on intonation, where canonical understanding is problematised by reference to actual texts and analyses. In such cases, I will clearly state both the origins of my thinking in such analyses and the considerations of theory in relation to what I've found. As Halliday always said, theory and application are always in dialogue with one another. And it just so happens that in terms of intonation study within SFL, there just hasn't been that much application through empirical work on intonation using Halliday's description of intonation. So I've often found in my own work issues arising that I feel have not been adequately addressed elsewhere in the SFL literature. Or perhaps issues that are just a result of the limitations of my own understanding. So perhaps you, the viewers, will be able to set me on the right path through your feedback. As I've shown in earlier episodes, in addition to choices in clause systems such as mood, speakers also have to choose from sets of options in intonation systems such as the tone system. In addition to choosing, for example, the polar interrogative mood, they also have to choose from one of the 5 primary tones, 2 compound tones, or one of their more delicate secondary tone choices. On the next slides, I will show Halliday's tone system in all its glory. In terms of structure, Halliday identifies, for example, the optional pre-tonic structure in the tone group, as well as the structure of salient syllable, or ictus, followed by optional non-salient syllables in the foot. I will come back to explore and problematise these structural interpretations of the tone group in later episodes. Likewise, I will come back in later episodes to firstly present, then problematise Halliday's account of the grammatical functions of tonicity choices in terms of given new structure. This structural perspective has long dominated work not only within SFL but outside of SFL. Halliday's pioneering conceptualisation of information structure, as given new, has been both immensely influential in phonological and other types of studies, while at the same time also often under-acknowledged. O'Grady 2016 gives an account of some of the issues that has been taken up about the SFL account of given new structure, which I will come back to later in the series. As I will discuss, the functions of textual intonation choices as choices have been underexplored. Taking a systemic view on textual intonation systems, such as tonicity, as choices from systemic potential rather than structural output, has all sorts of interesting implications. Building on work by Thea Van Leuven and Wendy Boucher, for example, I will come back in later episodes to explore what it means to choose in the textual metafunction, an issue that has continued to fascinate me since my PhD candidature. As promised, here is part of the tone system as presented in Halliday's famous 1967 book Intonation and Grammar in British English. Note also the explanation of system conventions at bottom right, showing how the concepts of system and delicacy are represented symbolically in SFL work. Here is another representation of the full tone system from a 1976 publication. I will go through all these intonation choices as I go along through the analyses presented in this series. The only way to really introduce them in any effective way, I've found, is to find instances of each choice in everyday naturally occurring spoken discourse, which I will do in the following episodes where I delve into the phonological analysis of various spoken texts. As I mentioned earlier, I wanted firstly in this series to introduce all these various theoretical concepts within SFL theory, and will continue to discuss these as the series goes along. But I want to get on in the following episodes to be doing some phonological analysis of intonation choices in actual spoken texts, to deal with all the various difficulties most of us find in trying to distinguish phonological choices out of the stream of authentic, naturally occurring speech. I don't pretend to have all the answers. As much as anything, I want this series to present the sorts of difficulties I find in analysing intonation within the SFL approach. I want to offer my takes on these, but also seek to reassure others that from someone who's been doing this work for 20 years, they are not the only ones who find intonation analysis difficult. I also want to emphasise, however, that essentially intonation analysis is in effect no more difficult than any other type of linguistic analysis. It just happens to involve the analysis of sound. I have great faith based on experience in the power of theory to help in the analysis process, even in terms of low-level phonological analysis. Thus, I will continue to draw attention to theoretical considerations throughout, using the phonological analyses as illustrations of key analytical issues and the proper application of theory to these issues. So, in addition to axis and delicacy, the third major SFL concept that I want to address in this lecture is that of instantiation, as articulated in the third edition of Introduction to Functional Grammar. The system of a language is instantiated in the form of text. The system is the underlying potential of a language, its potential as a meaning-making resource. System and text are thus related through instantiation. The relationship between system and text is a cline, the cline of instantiation. System and text define the two poles of the cline, that of the overall potential and that of a particular instance. Between these two poles there are intermediate patterns. These patterns can be viewed either from the system pole as subsystems or from the instance pole as instance types. So, as I've mentioned, a basic principle of SFL theory is that of choice. Speakers choose from sets of options as systems or paradigms, each of which forms a potential for speakers to make choices in actual texts. Those choices which combine to make meanings in texts are called instances. Thus, each choice is an instance from a systemic potential, which together with other choices makes meaning. Such choices pattern within texts, within what are called registers or text types of language, which are sub-potentials operating within specific contexts. The concept of systemic sub-potential or register means that we are not entirely free to use the full resources of language wherever we go. Instead, we are constrained in particular contexts to use a subset of the overall language potential for meaning. Our potential for making meaning in a job interview, for example, is considerably different to our meaning-making potential when ordering a pizza over the phone, and both are different again to our potential for meaning-making when hanging out with close friends. Because of these constraints, these systemic sub-potentials, our language choices pattern in particular ways in particular types of text. For example, think of the language we use in chatting with a close friend one-on-one compared to how we talk with a pizza salesperson selling over the phone. The first example in this slide is taken from an actual telephone sales interaction that I studied for my PhD, which I presented in episode 2 of this series. Can I start the order with your phone number, please? As I discussed in episode 2, this is a typical opening move in a telephone fast food sales text. A polar interrogative choice is made from the system of mood in the clause grammar, which systemic choice is indicated by the finite subject structure, can I? As discussed in episode 2, typically in its unmarked function, Polar interrogative mood choice is used to enact a yes-no question in the system of speech function, in the discourse semantics. That is, the polar interrogative choice functions to find out whether or not something is, or in this case, whether the speaker can or cannot do something. So in this text, if this polar interrogative mood choice were being used in its congruent function, the speaker would be asking whether or not they can start the order with the customer's phone number by using this polar interrogative mood choice. That is what this polar interrogative choice means in its congruent use. But of course, as we all will know as members of the culture, that is not what is going on here in this move. And in this data set of many such sales texts, only once does a customer answer congruently, yes, you can, obviously for their own amusement. As the customer servant, the speaker is using the can-I grammatical structure metaphorically to enact deference or politeness to the customer. A sales assistant always has to do this. Part of the context of this text is that the salesperson has to be deferential, hence the term customer servant. This is part of what is called the tenor aspect of context in SFL theory. To account for the meanings of choices in text, we have to take into consideration the social relations, including power relations, of the interactants as realised through their language choices. The polar interrogative mood in this context is therefore not functioning congruently to enact a yes-no question, but is functioning metaphorically to enact deference as the realisation of the unequal power relations between the salesperson and the customer. But of course, the telephone sales operator also has a particular job to do, which is to get the customer details as a first step in the interaction as efficiently as possible. A couple of occasions, customers in this data set immediately try to start giving their food order once the phone call commences, and they are quickly cut off by the salesperson who explains that they need to get the customer's details first. There is a script that the salesperson has to follow. So the salesperson here doesn't want to start a discussion as to whether or not they really can start the order. In other words, they don't really want to negotiate who is in charge of the interaction or how it will proceed. If they used a rising pitch contour, tone 2, as in the second example in this slide, this really would sound like a yes-no question, as a genuine request for permission to start the order with the phone number. Can I start the order with your phone number, please? That would, of course, sound a little odd in this context, although it would be taken still to mean a demand for information for the customer's details. So the authority of the salesperson to lead the interaction is assumed as part of the knowledge of our contemporary culture. As fast food customers over the phone, we just follow along with what the salesperson directs us to do. In an actual restaurant in person, of course, these interactions proceed a little differently when there is a waiter at our table. Context matters. So in fact, of course, the telephone sales operator actually wants to take charge of this sales exchange from the start, as the person responsible for facilitating the sale of fast food over the phone as fast as possible, hence the term fast food. Thus, they also choose a tone 1 from the tone system, the falling pitch contour, which, as I've discussed, is associated in the congruent case with statements, commands, or content questions. Can I start the order with your phone number, please? It is the tone 1 choice that thus tells the customer to interpret this move not as a request for permission to start the order, but as a request for the phone numbers, customer's phone number details, or a demand for their details. The meaning of this move is in effect to give me your phone number, or what is your phone number. We can't actually tell which of these because this speech function is enacted not through the clause system of mood, but through the tone group, through the tone group system of tone. as I've said, it is the tone 1 that tells us that this is actually a demand for information. Likewise, using the compound tone 1-3, falling contour plus level rise contour, would also sound rude in this context, even with the please tacked on the end. Either give me your phone number please, or what is your phone number please. This move still sounds a bit too abrupt, assertive or impolite from a salesperson. The first version sounds a little like one might expect in a bank robbery. Give me your phone number please. Most people, of course, are not consciously making such choices or conscious of these contextual constraints, these register subpotentials. Yet such complex co-selections and metaphorical uses of clause and tone group systems are routine in everyday social life. Speakers are immensely skillful in negotiating the complexities of social life, such as the tension between being a customer servant while also being the operator in charge of taking an order for pizza as efficiently as possible, or being a customer in such an interaction, how we are expected to behave. And we are very much aware when speakers transgress these unwritten rules of contextual constraint. Many of the difficulties we have in our everyday social lives arise from tensions between what is expected or tolerated in specific contexts and what is actually said in terms of such tone choices in combination with mood choices. As I'll show in later episodes, textual intonation choices also can create social frictions in spoken dialogue through assigning prominence to the interpersonal aspects of the clause. For example, if the finite is given tonic focus, can I start the order with your phone number, please? It can sound a bit impatient, right? When the interpersonal aspects of our moves in discourse are given textual prominence, this can sound like and lead to tension in our social relations. In the third example in this slide, we can see an instance where an imperative command with a tone 1 could, perhaps, be considered more appropriate, perhaps in more familiar contexts, such as between close friends or family members. Give me a break. There is still something of a sense of rudeness, of course, in this move, but such interpersonal license tends to be tolerated amongst those who are close to each other. The systemic subpotential is a little different in a tenor relation of equality and familiarity. We could say it's probably expanded. It's not hard to imagine a context, though, where saying this might instead get you into a lot of trouble. So we can understand the idea of systemic potential and instances of choice from that potential by considering what was chosen against the background of what could have been chosen and wasn't. We also need to consider function, in particular the idea that to describe language and meaning, we need to take into account the functions of such choices within and with respect to the context of utterance. Text and language choices in the contexts of social life. We can also see the concept of a meaning subpotential at work here. In different types of context, the meaning potentials available to us are different. But there is more to register subpotential than just language variation and contextual constraint. The same set of choices from clause and tone group can mean one thing in one context and another thing in another context. Or rather, perhaps we can say that the same choices can have different consequences in different contexts. Saying, give me a break, during a job interview might be said to have the same meaning as when talking with an intimate friend, but the implications are likely to be quite different. The listener will understand such a move differently depending on the social relations between the interactants. A polar interrogative choice from a fast food salesperson is assumed to be deference and not, as it might be in other contexts, a genuine request for permission to do something. Example, can I sit here please? Thus, the idea of systemic subpotential or register language is important in understanding how language can mean differently in the different contexts of social life. Thus, register subpotentials also enable us, as well as constraining what we can say, to expand our meaning potential, because in different contexts the same words or grammatical choices can mean different things. Thus our meaning potential overall is increased. For example, in the same way that the word mood in SFL means something different to its use in psychology or in everyday conversation, so too clause grammar choices such as polar interrogative or tone choices mean differently in different contexts, and thus register language subpotentials massively expand our potential for making meaning across all the varied contexts of our social semiotic life. Later in the series I will come back to discuss these aspects in terms of work by Martin and others on genre, as another stratum set up to account for how such choices and patterns of choice are structured within and across texts, across different phases and stages of a text. Intonation plays a role in this respect too. For example, these telephone fast food sales texts often end with the salesperson signing off with a tone 5. So we'll see you in approximately half an hour. The rise-fall contour of the tone 5 signals that the interaction as a whole is finished. One finds a similar phenomenon in many pieces of music. And one finds a similar use of tone 5 at the end of long monologic turns, example to finish a recount in a casual conversation that I studied. So, in the first 7 episodes in this series, I have introduced the series, its key aspects, and its theoretical foundations, which are the dimensions of systemic functional theory. Stratification theorises intonation as both sound and as sense. Choices in different strata are realised or expressed by choices in lower strata, and in turn realise choices in higher strata at different levels of abstraction, with sound being the expression of phonological choices and so on. Metafunction theorises the relations between language and its social uses in terms of 4 basic functions or metafunctions: experiential, logical, interpersonal, and textual systems of language. And these different metafunctions have their own forms of expression. Rank and axis theorise systems and structures at different levels or ranks, and in relation to each other as different axes of language, as what we can and have to do in language. Delicacy shows how systems and choices from systems are related in terms of the further systemic options available when a choice is made in a system. And instantiation shows how actual choices are related with the systemic potential behind them, with subpotentials operating in specific contexts as both constraint on and expansion of our meaning potential, and corresponding with patterns of choice in texts. I've also presented some texts and their analyses in the episodes so far, and discussed various issues arising in the study of intonation. This summary concludes part 1 of this series. As I mentioned earlier, I've had to string these episodes along in an ordered manner, so as to introduce all these theoretical concepts as foundation in a structured way. Like an ordinary written textbook, this series, this multimodal textbook, also has its own structural obligations. SFL as a holistic theory is difficult to present because it is difficult to talk about one aspect without talking about other aspects in relation to that aspect. As I've said, I find it impossible to talk about intonation as sound without firstly being clear about the theoretical viewpoint that I'm taking. As Pike wrote, quoted in episode 3, one's theory is part of the account one is giving, a part of the observer. And thus to be explicit about one's own theoretical viewpoint is to enable the descriptions being presented to be calibrated against that viewpoint. Statements about theory are how you make sense of the material being presented in this series. To proceed straight into discussion of all the many issues that I find when analysing intonation without having this theoretical toolkit as foundation would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. I would simply end up assuming a whole lot of theoretical concepts without explaining them, which would make things worse. In the next episodes, in part 2, which will be much more standalone, I will begin dealing in earnest with phonological analysis of intonation. But I will also be pointing to the discourse functions of intonation choices as I go along, and also to interesting aspects to explore further. For example, to go back to episode 1, the endlessly intriguing issue of the natures and social roles and relations of speech and writing in contemporary culture, where speech is increasingly recorded and writing increasingly used for spontaneous dialogic interaction, resulting in all sorts of tensions as each was designed not for such purposes but for their prototypical roles, writing for recording monologic statements, speech as everyday ephemeral dialogic interaction. Following the episodes in part 2 focusing on phonological analysis, I will then, in part 3, turn in earnest to consider a discourse semantic perspective to account for the functions of intonation choices in combination with clause choices in making meaning in spoken discourse. Here I will be more or less venturing into new territory. Within the Hallidayan tradition of intonation analysis, there really has been relatively little work on discourse semantics that incorporates these choices in intonation that I've been presenting and discussing so far. I will be, of course, further addressing and exploring theoretical issues as I go along throughout parts 2 and 3. For example, I will address the use of terminology such as markedness and grammatical metaphor, perhaps doing so in occasional standalone episodes or in relation to a particular analysis of text. Although most scholars in SFL, in my experience, consider the phonological analysis of intonation to be the most daunting aspect, once one has mastered phonological analysis and starts really getting into analysing authentic everyday spoken texts, it becomes apparent, or at least it has to me over the years, that there are far greater issues and challenges in considering the discourse functions of intonation choices and the theoretical considerations such analyses entail. But it is more or less impossible, I have found, to discuss such issues unless one has done sufficient intonational analysis to actually see or hear these theoretical issues as exemplified in actual analysis of texts. That is why, after these theoretical preliminaries have concluded in this episode, I want to spend some time focusing on how to analyse intonation as phonological choice, both to help students in learning what I've learnt in doing this type of analysis for almost 20 years, while also starting to illustrate, to show through empirical examples, how such choices work and the implications that arise in terms of our understanding of certain aspects of SFL theory. With any luck, after these grueling introductory episodes, the following episodes might be a little more fun.